Well, as I believe, said before, this is a great work of art. It's a great literary document, and it has this very complex structure, which is helpful actually because it breaks up the long dialogue into sections. And the first section, the very first section, we're reminded that this character Phaedo is narrating the whole thing to a friend, which is one of these things in Plato. People narrate very long conversations. Take that for what it is. I don't know, but the first part of it really is setting the scene. Socrates is in the prison. This is the day when he will be drinking the poison in execution of the death sentence for corrupting the youth of Athens and all the rest of it, what he was convicted of in the Apology. And we have this really fascinating introductory section where Socrates talks about dreams that he had and why he's writing poetry, which is a very different thing for him, and really kind of establishes that at least one of those charges, that he doesn't believe in the gods, has got to be false, right? Does he believe the gods have, through a dream, have commanded him to write poetry? So he thinks it's his duty to write poetry. So interesting, very interesting. But how do we actually get into it? How does this introductory section, which is a narration of what the events of him waking on this day and beginning to speak to his friends, how do we get into the actual philosophical topic, which is certainly the nature of the soul or the immortality of the soul? It is here on page 53, next to letter C in the margin. This other character, a very important character named Simmias, says, "What kind of advice is this you are giving to Evenus, Socrates? I have met him many times, and from my observation, he's not at all likely to follow it willingly." Well, Socrates says that right up here, that if Evenus is wise, he'll follow him as soon as possible. And that means follow him into death, which is a very odd thing to say. You know, if Evenus, this character, Evenus, poet, I guess, if he's smart, he'll want to follow me as quickly as possible. And Simmias is understandably surprised. Like, what are you talking about? I mean, you're going to die, man. And so this leads us into Socrates having to explain that. And his explanation begins here. "How so?" said he. This is Socrates speaking. "Is not Evenus a philosopher?" And this leads into this whole first section, which is quite important. The idea that the philosopher welcomes death. And as Socrates says, that the philosopher's life is a preparation for death, a practice for death, which is a very strange idea. But he explains it. And as it turns out, and there is this preliminary argument about suicide and how philosophers, even if they welcome death, shouldn't commit suicide. We'll ignore that for the moment. And then here on page 55, let us try, Socrates says, to make my defense to you more convincing than it was to the jury. Constant, sort of reference to the situation. The events of the Apology are still fresh. I want to make my argument, he says, before you, my judges, as to why I think that a man who has truly spent his life in philosophy is probably right to be of good cheer in the face of death, and to be very hopeful that after death he will attain the greatest blessings yonder. Okay, again, well, what is he talking about? Well, ultimately, he's talking about knowledge. And if we think about the word philosophy, it doesn't mean, well, what does it mean? It means love of knowledge, literally, philos and sophia, love. knowledge. The philosopher is a lover of knowledge, and philosophy is the love of knowledge. And if knowledge is what the philosopher truly loves and has truly spent their lives pursuing, the Socrates point is that that can only really find fruition after the soul has separated from the body. And that means that, well, it means something very interesting. Socrates says here in the bottom of page 56, when he asks, does the soul grasp the truth? That is, how is truth, how is knowledge to be actually obtained? And his point is, it's not through the body. That whatever we get through the senses, through the bodily senses, is not truth. That at best, it's a sort of, I mean, not at best, it's actually kind of an illusion, which again is interestingly parallel to what Krishna tells Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita. He says here on page 57, the soul reasons best when none of these senses troubles it. Neither hearing, nor sight, nor pain, nor pleasure, but when it is most by itself, taking leave of the body, and as far as possible having no contact or association with it in its search for reality. So that even in life, Socrates says, the philosopher gets closest to the truth when they're able to separate as far as possible from their bodies. And this leads us directly into the theory of the forms, which is incredibly important for this dialogue and comes up again and again. So we'll have different shots at it. The first introduction is here on page 57, when Socrates says, what about the following, Simmias? Do we say that there is such a thing as the just itself or not? And the beautiful and the good? Notice that they're all capitalized. Those are examples of what Plato, or in translation, called the forms. Justice in itself, the beautiful in itself, the good in itself. That these are the things that constitute true knowledge, or knowledge of them would constitute true knowledge. And Socrates says, have you ever grasped them with any of your bodily senses? And their all answer to that is no. So the idea is that the true knowledge, which is knowledge of these essences, beauty in itself, the good in itself, justice in itself, virtue in itself, that during life we are hampered by the body in our pursuit of knowledge of these things. And what is death? And we'll turn to this. Well, he characterizes it here. This is page 58. I have to forgive me, I'm working with a new translation, but I'll find the other spot that I want to eventually. Socrates says, and that freedom and separation of the soul from the body is called death. Okay, so let's just take the latter part of that. We'll ignore the freedom part for the moment and just say that the separation of the soul from the body is called death. So you can see the logic of his argument here, defending the claim that the philosopher welcomes death. The evenness should follow him as soon as possible. Because the separation from the soul from the body is the time when the philosopher can gain true knowledge. That is, that all the things that they have pursued in life become really possible once the soul is separated from the body, and that's what death is. So, yes. So the explanation of the surprising claim that death is to be welcomed is explained because the true philosopher only gets, or the philosopher only gets what they truly want. after this separation of the soul from the body. That true knowledge comes after death. And so that's really the first part of the argument. Really kind of a really incredible piece here where Socrates is defending the philosophical life as much as he's defending the thesis that, that the philosopher should welcome death. So that's really the first part of it, and an incredibly important part of it. It has all these different elements that are important to the dialogue as a whole, especially this notion that, okay, what is death? Death is the separation of soul and body. Why should it be welcomed? Because the soul then is able to attain true knowledge of the things that that the philosopher could only obtain partial knowledge of when the soul was connected with the body. So that first part of the argument really runs to about bottom of page 60, where Socrates sums it up by saying, "This is my defense." Again, a constant, reference, allusion to the trial and the apology. "This is my defense, Simmias and Cebes, that I am likely to be right to leave you and my masters here without resentment and complaint, believing that there, in the afterlife, as here, I shall find good masters and good friends. If my defense is more convincing to you than to the Athenian jury, it will be well." Constant reference to the apology. That's really the first part of it. So the second part of it begins here at the bottom of page 60, when Cebes very delicately makes an objection.